Well, recently, maybe not so recently by now, someone sent me a link to a blog which stated that better identification of Viking corpses reveals half the warriors were female. And unfortunately, as blogs and also news articles sometimes do, they take a scientific discovery and butcher it and jump to conclusions, but there is a kernel of truth at least. So let's look at that. The paper in question is written by Dr. Shane McLeod from the University of Stirling, who has a bachelor with honors in medieval history with archaeology, a master of Viking and early medieval Scandinavia, and a PhD in medieval history. So a person that can be expected to have some competence. The paper actually set out to examine the ratio of female to male Norse settlers in England in the 9th century. That's all it aimed to do. It was not about trying to figure out how many warriors were male or female, whatever. But there are still some relevant observations. So generally the question is, how do you actually identify individuals in graves as male or female? Usually, traditionally, it has been done by looking at the grave goods, if possible. Sometimes you have minimal grave goods for either sex, so then it can be difficult to determine. But you can imagine the problem with that is it's basically circular reasoning. Determining the sex by the grave goods basically means it's impossible to find female warriors if they exist, because if warrior equipment is present, you automatically jump to the conclusion that it must be male. But when graves are actually sexed osteologically, that is by examining the skeleton, occasionally you do find different results. So let's look at some of the archaeological evidence. Just a few examples. There is a mortuary in Repton, South Derbyshire, for instance, with a burial of a female skeleton with an axe, seeks, and sword pieces, and that one was determined osteologically. Another one is a burial mound in Heathwood, not far from Repton actually, where you have one female skeleton and one with uncertain sex, which contains a sword hilt, shield clamps, and a knife. What the paper certainly demonstrates is that some Viking warriors who invaded England definitely brought their women with them, and there are apparently also cases of armed women. But that's not the only source of evidence. You also have a couple of other graves in other regions, which clearly show that there were women with weapons as grave goods. One of the clearest examples that I've come across is in Vergina, Macedonia. Archaeologists have found the remains of King Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, which is really an amazing find. And the antechamber of the royal tomb contained the bones of a female warrior. And the researchers think she might be the daughter of a Scythian king. She died between age 30 and 34. So how do they actually know that she was a warrior? Well, for one, her bones show signs of frequent riding on horseback. And more important, the grave also contains spears, arrows, and a quiver, as well as greaves. And the greaves obviously belong to her, because she had a fracture in the upper end of the leg that caused a shortening of the leg. And those greaves are mismatched, one is shorter than the other, so those are very clearly made for her. And someone who is not expected to fight has no business wearing greaves or having weapons as grave goods. And the final example I'd like to mention is a burial in Pokrovka, Russia. I'll probably butcher that name, but I tried at least. Where the remains of a young Sarmatian warrior priestess were found, buried with an amulet with bronze arrowhead, as well as 40 more bronze arrowheads, as well as an iron akinakes, if I pronounce that right, a type of short sword. So these are just very few archaeological examples of burials with female skeletons and weapons. There are many more such examples, but of course, overall, it's still the exception. I mean, the vast majority of warriors in history were male. But this does confirm that there were indeed female warriors. You have plenty of historical reports of such from all over the world, really. Quite often, the historical sources are disputed because you have quite a few historical writers who took liberties here and there in their accuracy of the reports. If you're interested in the historical accounts, I would suggest reading this book here, Women Warlords by Tim Newark. It deals with a wide variety of historical sources, from the original Amazons of antiquity to Amazons of the jungle, to Celtic queens, to women fighting in medieval times and the 100 Years' War. So whenever you see or hear someone completely dismiss and reject that there were any fighting women in history at all, you know this is false. However, when somebody makes a claim such as half the warriors were female, that is also bogus. But let's leave it there for now. I don't want this video to become too long. Of course, you could talk for hours about this topic. But yeah, hopefully this was interesting. And thanks for listening.